And Stewart, when you were talking about the early days of Slack, and I might have this wrong, but I remember a talk you gave 4 or 5 years ago in which you said Slack was originally, I think, a video game company, and you guys were all in different places, and you pivoted to this incredibly creative idea that became Slack. Do you think that the fact that you were apart physically might have, how did that play into it? Maybe too hard of a counterfactual, but you were talking about the benefits of asynchronous kind of development, and you were very asynchronous at the time. And I'm just wondering if you think that there's any part of that in your origin story.
It's definitely a part of it, the physically being separated. And I think also, there's a bunch of historical accidents. Everyone who worked at the company at that time was a relatively old school user of the internet, and so used a service called IRC, Internet Relay Chat, which actually predates the web by a few years. And that's the basis of moving conversations to channels. And there's I think a flow of fully synchronous to completely asynchronous, and this semi-synchronicity that allows for the punctuated burstiness that Adam was talking about earlier. That Slack does especially well. And the way that I realize there's a lot of spatial language in how we talked about it. So you create a channel for everything. And for us, that's every customer, every team, every office location, every functional area, every kind of project or event. Once you do that, everyone knows where to go to ask their question. Everyone knows where to go to give their update. Everyone knows where to go to get up to speed, which really transforms the relationship to information. Because in some sense, email, theoretically, does all of, or can be made to do all of the same work. And if you're displaced geographically or in time zones, I think that could help, but it's the accessibility of information without it having to be in your inbox that really makes a difference. So we decided on Friday, March 6th, we were going to strongly encourage everyone to work from home the following week. And immediately there's these new work streams that sprung up that weren't there before. We had to reschedule 500 on-site interviews and cancel all these customer events. So think about that 96-hour period from we made the decision, the next day we communicated to the company, next day was Sunday, everyone rested, and then Monday we began the new remote work reality. It would have been 15 or 20,000 emails I would have to have been CC'd on to have the same access to information, because I didn't obviously look at all of it, but it was all accessible. So if I wanted to check how it was going with the recruiters, I could go check on that. There was an executive hire that was in progress. I could go check and make sure that we were closing there, look at specific customers. It was all accessible. And the key thing is not just to me as the CEO, but to a couple thousand employees. And the degree of alignment you're able to create there, even given the displacement in time or space, I think is impossible to create any other way. The last thing I would say, there's obviously a spectrum of personality types and predispositions. And one of the things we heard we're not expecting really early on in the development of Slack was, I'm paraphrasing because it's a synthesis of a bunch of people, but it's literally hundreds of people would say, hey, I'm really introverted, and until Slack, I never really spoke up in meetings. I like to take a little bit more time to formulate my thoughts. And I really appreciate that now I can contribute to these conversations, which otherwise just, that happened in the hour-long bounds of the meeting, and the decision was already made and we kind of had moved on. So I think that is a great signal for broadening the aperture of input that you're able to take.
And Adam, just reacting to that, are there other things that you've seen in workplaces, either practices or technologies that that empower those introverts and create more of this collaboration?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to recognize that we actually all need to work intermittently and in collaboration. There's some cool evidence that people come up with more great ideas when they're working alone than when they're in groups. In part because groups tend to fall into patterns of groupthink. And so instead of everybody engaging in divergent thinking, you get all this convergent thinking and everybody has the same view. But on the flip side, you have more good ideas in groups than you do when people are working alone. And that's because groups often bring the wisdom of crowds. They're able to do some quality filtering. They're able to weed out some of the really bad ideas. And sadly, we have no idea which of our own ideas are really terrible. So I think because of that, one of the things we need to do is we need to even ask extroverts, right, to occasionally work independently. And then when we come together, the hope is that they've had some time to process as well as introverts do. One of the easy things now that we're all, or many of us are working in video conference, is to say, okay, if I'm going to pose a question to a group, and I've been doing this in my research lab over the past few weeks, instead of just immediately calling on someone, I'll ask everyone to jot down some thoughts. And then when we're ready, we paste them all into the chat. And that way, everybody's had a chance to think separately. In the creativity literature, this is called brain writing before brainstorming. And it is, I think it's one of the easiest ways to get the best of both worlds empirically. And I actually love that there's a tool to naturally do that, as opposed to when everybody's sitting in a room, it feels sort of awkward to sit there silently. But in a video conference, it's perfectly normal. So would love to see more brain writing. It seems to help not only introverts, but extroverts too.
Adam, the last question for you is, you've written this phenomenal book with Sheryl Sandberg, Option B, about finding strength in a time of adversity. And all of us are going through some adversity, some of the most horrific kind, others more modest, just adapting to social distancing and the like. Do you have some advice for folks based on that book and the thought and the thinking you did there on how to cope and just get through life?
I do. Do you want me to give it?
Yes.
So, yeah, look, I think right now we're all living some version of option B. No one wanted this crisis to happen. If we could undo it, we all would. But we're stuck with it. And I think given that we're stuck with it, one of the best things we can do is we can avoid these two traps that psychologists have studied for years, which are permanence and pervasiveness. There's a sense of permanence that comes from not being able to imagine the end date that Stewart was talking about earlier. Right? We don't know if we're going to be back to work in the summer or in the fall or next year. We don't know when we can travel again. And because of that uncertainty, we often project that indefinitely into the future and feel like it's never going to end. And I think when you catch yourself saying that or feeling that sense of never or always, it's just worth remembering that even though we don't have an end date, we do know it will end, right? This crisis is not going to go on forever. And then the other trap is a sense of pervasiveness. It's the idea that when my life gets worse in lots of ways, it's worse in every way. It's kind of like that song, Everything is Awesome, only it's become everything is awful. And I think we need to look at that a little more critically, right? And say, okay, look, many people are in horrible situations right now. I know lots of people who have lost loved ones. We know many people who are sick, who are unemployed, but not every part of life is worse, right? A lot of people can look at their lives and say, I have more family time, or I have a little bit of extra flex time, or at least I don't have to change out of pajama bottoms every day, or I don't have to have as many awkward interactions with strangers as I used to. And so I think finding those silver linings just reminds us that not everything is worse in our lives, even if the situation is pretty bad.
No, that's so beautifully said, Adam. Thank you so much for that. It resonates with me so much. Stewart, for you, very early on in the coronavirus crisis, I saw you step up as a philanthropist in a way that almost no one, at least to my knowledge, had at the time. It was very early and incredibly generous. And I wanted to ask you a little about that, why you did it, and do you see some lessons both for your friends who have a lot to give, but also for those of us who don't? And what could we do on a daily basis to mirror, obviously not to match, but to mirror what you've done here?
To be totally honest, the contributing the money is the easy part. There's a lot of volunteer efforts that we were supporting and people contributing their time. I think it's probably ultimately, it's certainly much more of a personal sacrifice and more demanding. I'll put it this way. One of my hopes from all this, kind of picking up on what Adam said, on the positive side, is it forces people to reevaluate priorities and systems and how we're living. And my real hope is that we don't squander that opportunity. Hopefully there's a realization that the idea of employer-sponsored healthcare is a terrible idea in this circumstance, at least, and people would do better to have a little bit more of a social safety net. And like, otherwise, what are we doing as a society? I mean, I think this might open up opportunities for more change associated with conversations around criminal justice reform or the approach to income inequality. So I think philanthropic stuff can help drive that or encourage a little bit, but it's really a decision we're going to have to make collectively.